Sam Alberry wrote a book called What God Has to Say About Our Bodies. And in this book, he claims that there's a certain age where physically things start to kind of go downhill. And I suppose that sort of wherever we're at in that physical journey, you can kind of fill in the blank. Maybe it's 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or whatever it is. Wherever kind of you're at, you kind of think this is where it's really I've lost control. Things are out of hand, and there's a certain point where you have to just cut it off, right? I mean, my son recently went back to play in an alumni baseball game from the school he graduated from. He said, I might have to see the physical trainer at the high school tomorrow. He's 23. I just said, shut up. You're not really in this discussion, okay? But I suppose there's a point. Maybe it's 30 or 40 and 50, 60, whatever you're thinking. For this author, he says it's age 40. And at age 40, some things just change. He said that the world starts to become too loud at age 40. You just have to try to turn everything down all the time. He said you get excited about bedtime at age 40. Right? We're looking forward to sleepy, nappy time. He said you still get injured, but now you don't have a good story for it. And he verifies this point by telling a story about a business trip he was on. He was staying in a hotel, and he went to bed that night, and everything was fine. He woke up in the morning with this searing, hot pain in his left shoulder. And it was so intense and so severe that he thought, I think this might be a heart attack. Something is seriously wrong. And so he called the front desk, and they sent paramedics and even a doctor, and they came to look at him in his hotel room. And as Alberry tells this story, the doctor at some point pulls out what he describes as the largest needle he had ever seen to administer just painkillers to his shoulder. And so the doctor injects the medicine into this guy's shoulder, and he's starting to recover a little bit and feel a little better. And he asked the doctor, what happened? What was really wrong? And the doctor, at just practicing the height of science and, his medical training, he said, I think you slept on it wrong. Alberry said, you get to an age where, the most severe, intense pain that you have ever experienced in your life happened because you went to sleep and laid down in a bed. Man, I've lost control, he said. Sometimes we find ourselves, I suppose physically, in a spot where we just feel like, I don't know how I got here. And certainly that's true in our lives, isn't it? We find ourselves once in a while in the middle of life just kind of going through a tough stretch, a difficult season. We just find ourselves in a world of hurt. And once in a while, let's acknowledge the truth that we can trace back decisions that we've made. I made A, B, C, and now I'm here dealing with D, and I'm in the middle of this world of hurt because of my own choices. But we've also probably experienced those seasons in life when it's not a decision we've made, it's not a choice that we've considered, it's not a wrong or right decision that we've made, but we find ourselves in a world of hurt just because the world is broken, and that brokenness is sort of falling on us at the time, at the moment. And we're just trying to figure out, what do I do in the middle of this season? What do I do with all of this hurt? I think the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 27, he finds himself in the middle of a world of hurt. And what's amazing about his response is that he decides, I'm going to worship, I'm going to point to God, I'm going to celebrate him no matter what's going on around me. If you recall, last week we left Paul in these three trials, and we kind of traced those in verses in chapters 25, 26, and 24, 25, and 26. And what we know about it is that no matter the judge that Paul found himself before, no matter the accusers that he was facing, no matter the accusations, no matter how true or false or valid or invalid they were, no matter the circumstances in each one of those trials that Paul found himself in, he was devoted to preaching and teaching and communicating one message, the gospel, the resurrection. And it was that sold out demeanor to just sharing over and over and over Jesus crucified, buried, and raised from the dead that got himself into all sorts of predicaments. It's why he was in those trials in the first place. And it's why he couldn't quite navigate himself, steer himself out of those trials. In fact, we get to the end of the story, and if you remember Herod Agrippa II, and he's talking to Festus, these two governors in the region, and Agrippa said, man, if this guy would have just kept his mouth shut, if he would have just been quiet, he's innocent, and we could have released him, but he had to appeal to Caesar, and so to Caesar he has to go. Now, I don't know the validity of that statement. I don't know how much of just a hand-washing kind of statement that was from Agrippa. I'm glad he's not our problem any longer, or whether they would have really released Paul if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. But he did, and now he's got to go. And so from prison in Caesarea, Festus releases him to this centurion, this Roman soldier who is kind of a part of a special guard. And you might think MPs in today's military. He's responsible for transporting stuff, in this case prisoners, from the outskirts of the Roman Empire to Rome. And so Festus turns Paul and some other prisoners over to this Julius, to this Roman centurion, and they load onto a ship and they take off for Rome. I don't know the last time you traveled, you flew somewhere, and sometimes maybe you're like me, you try to find those direct flights, you don't want to lay over somewhere, and that's kind of a hassle, and so sometimes you have to do that though, you lay over. In the ancient world, it was travel by layover. There was no direct flight or sailing in this case from one point to another. There were lots of stops along the way, and as you open up your Bibles to Acts chapter 27, you can kind of follow along the itinerary, and you can see all the different stops that Paul makes along the way. And the first leg of the journey was a rather short one, and they sail from Caesarea to Sidon, and they stop there, and the centurion, he finds favor with Paul, and so he lets Paul and his traveling mates go and meet with the church, and they're able to receive supplies from the church, and Paul is able to minister to the believers there before they leave again and set sail. And they leave and they go around Cyprus, and they head across the sea to Cilicia, and they change ships at Myra, where they board a larger ship, the ship coming from Alexandria out of Egypt on its way to Rome, weighed down with grain. It was a grain cargo ship, and so 276 people are on board this ship, and they're heading out. They sailed with great difficulty until they reached Crete, and they stop in this harbor, the Fair Havens, this little community on the island of Crete, and it's here that they have to make another decision. They've already fallen behind schedule, and so Luke gives us an update. He said the calendar is past the fast. That's the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and so they're in the middle of October. And in the ancient world, they would stop sailing usually around that time, but definitely before the second week in November. Nobody in their right mind would sail from about the middle of November to February until spring again. And so they're just on the cusp of that. They're just in that situation where it's sort of like driving up to the yellow light, You've got to decide. Right? Is it time for me to go, or is it time for me to stay? And Paul is never shy, is he? He just speaks up right away. Guys, look, this is the deal. We shouldn't leave here. We have to stay here for the winter. If we leave here, bad things are going to happen to each one of us and to the boat, and it's not going to be good. And Julius the centurion is in charge of this trip. He's responsible to Caesar. He's responsible to Rome. And so he takes in the advice from Paul, and then he seeks the advice of the owner of the ship and the captain of the ship. And the owner of the ship and the captain of the ship, the pilot of the ship, say, I think we should head out and we should keep going. There are a couple reasons for this probably. First, this little town was just that. It was a little podunk town. There wasn't anything there. And 276 people, they didn't have the resources to accommodate them for the several months that they would be wintering in this harbor. It wasn't an especially safe harbor. And the next stop, Phoenix, on the island of Crete, was only 40 miles away. And they thought, we can get to the bigger city, the better harbor. We can stop there for the winter. It's not very far. It's like, a day trip. We can head out and do this. And so Julius listens to the owner of the ship and the pilot who are on board. We got to get to Phoenix. Let's head out there. And so Julius agrees, and they start out on this 3-hour tour, because that's sort of what happens. They're sailing along the coast, and right away things seem to be okay. A storm swells up, and the winds come and sweep them out to the sea. This is a bad deal. In the ancient world, we kind of think of cruise ships and cargo ships sailing across the ocean. In the ancient world, sailors did not like to be in the middle of the sea. They preferred to sail around the coast where they could see the land. The sea was a dangerous and wild place. And the ship is just swept out to sea. The storm comes in. They throw things overboard, lightening the load, but the storm never lightens. They go days without seeing the sun or the stars. And this is especially troubling because there was no compass on board. There was no GPS on board. The only thing these sailors had to know where in the world they were the sun and the stars. And without access to them, with only clouds and darkness and rain and storm to see, they were lost at sea, quite literally. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know how they could get back. And it's at this moment that Paul decides, I'll speak up again. And Paul, you gotta love him. I just love Paul, if not for this reason, because Paul decides I need to speak up again, and the first words out of his mouth were, I told you so. You should have listened to me. We should have never left. And now, man, we're in this mess, aren't we? Things aren't looking good. He follows that up quickly by saying, but take heart. Don't be afraid. I kind of get the first part. Right? They are lost at sea. Things are not going well. They've tossed things overboard. They've literally tied the ship up so it won't break apart. They're not in a good situation. So I get the first part of Paul's speech here. I told you so. Look at what's going on now. The second part, take heart. Don't be afraid. Man, you look around, there seems to be all sorts of stuff to be afraid of, all sorts of stuff to fear, not much reason to be encouraged. And so Paul has to go quickly to why they ought to take heart. Because that very night, Paul said, I was visited by an angel sent from the God whom I serve and to whom I belong. And he said that not one person on this trip would perish. Not one person would die. You can absolutely count on my God. He is big enough and able enough and strong enough, and he keeps his word. Nobody will die on this trip. But the boat, we're going to crash that on an island. That's Paul's message. in the middle of this. And sure enough, the next day, it's the 14th night of the storm. People are anxious. Sailors are anxious. They decide we need to figure out. They kind of sense that they are close to land. They just have that intuition, I guess, as a sailor. And so they take these long ropes. They've tied these giant knots like 6 feet apart in these ropes. They're weighed down, of course, at the end of the rope, and they toss those over the side of the ship to measure how deep the water is. And they do that a couple of times, and they quickly realize that they are heading into more and more shallow water. And so they assume they are heading to land. In fact, they think they're heading towards this particular place in North Africa. Remember, they have no idea where they are. And so they assume the worst, that they're heading to this place that is famous for ships crashing into the sand there. And so they decide we've got to do something. Sailors, under the pretense of lowering anchors to slow their movement to ground, they try to lower the lifeboat down so that this group of sailors could get in and flee for safety. Paul sees them doing this, and he warns Julius the centurion, look, God said, if any of those guys leave, we're all done for. And so Julius steps in, and he keeps those sailors and the lifeboat on board. And eventually the boat does run aground, and begins to break apart. And at that point, Julius again steps in, because now the sailors aren't the trouble, but the soldiers are the trouble. And the soldiers responsible for all these prisoners think, it would be better for us to execute the prisoners right now rather than be responsible if they escape in the chaos of the shipwreck. And so they go about business to set up just offing all of these prisoners on board. And Julius said, we're not going to do that. If you can swim, jump right now. And he rescues Paul, and the folks that can swim jump overboard and try to make it to land, and everyone else grabs a piece of that boat. And that's how every single one of those 276 people are rescued by God in the middle of this shipwreck. Kind of ran past a part in this story after Paul makes his speech and said, you ought to take heart. And the next day, he gathers folks together, and he said, look, you're going to need a little food, a little nourishment to be able to swim to shore. And he breaks bread, and he prays, and he worships in the middle of all of that chaos. It's amazing to me, all these things that have happened to Paul. This isn't his first shipwreck, or his second shipwreck, or his third shipwreck. It's his fourth shipwreck. He's been beaten and arrested and tried. In the middle of all of this, he finds a way to give thanks. Look, I don't know what kind of season you're navigating right now. I don't know if it's one of those stormy seasons where nothing seems to be going right, or if it's just smooth sailing. But no matter what you're experiencing, we can give thanks through it all. And I think this story of Paul's shipwreck in Acts chapter 27 offers us 4 strategies to giving thanks, worshiping God, no matter the spot we find ourselves in. If you turn to Acts chapter 27, we're just going to sort of dive into the story in 4 different places here and work rather quickly through these 4 strategies. The first strategy is to help others. It seems a little bit odd to say, I know you're going through this really hard time, but what you ought to do is pay attention to someone else. But that's what Paul does. That's what the church does. Here in Acts chapter 27, the first 3 verses, this is what God's word says. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in the ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. All right, so an interesting beginning to our story here. Paul's boarding this ship. He's not alone as he gets on board this ship, of course. And the very first verse here in chapter 27, when it was decided that we should sail for Italy. If you recall, there are different spots in the book of Acts where Luke starts to use this pronoun. He changes it from third person to first person. We call these the we sections. And they're a hint that Luke is with them on the trip. And that's probably why we get so much information information about the itinerary of this shipwreck journey to Rome. And so Luke is with him, and then Aristarchus is with him as well. This is the guy from Thessalonica who is evidently a prisoner on board as well. He shows up in a couple of Paul's letters a little later where Paul refers to him as my fellow prisoner. And so whether he was in the same sort of trouble as Paul was in, or in some other kind of trouble, or if he was just traveling with Paul and stayed with him while Paul was in custody, these guys are sailing with Paul on this journey. And they make this first leg of the trip and everything goes well. They stop outside on, and Julius treated Paul kindly. Paul wasn't a condemned prisoner. Lots of these prisoners on this trip had already faced trial. They'd been convicted. They were on their way to Rome, not to appeal to Caesar, but to pay a price to Caesar. They were on their way to the Colosseum to be executed or whatever fate was in store for them. And so that separated the Apostle Paul out from many of the prisoners a little bit. He was still on trial, kind of innocent until proven guilty sort of idea. Let's not impose that on the Roman Empire, but that's sort of where we're at with him. He's not facing a conviction as of yet. He's also traveling with these two guys, with Luke and Aristarchus, and it makes it look like Paul has some status. And so they assume that Paul had some status as well. Julius just finds favor with him. Maybe that's the hand of God, or maybe it's these other reasons, but he likes Paul. I remember my senior year of high school. Barely, it's a long time ago, but I remember it. And the first semester I was taking this physics class, and it wasn't just it was an honors physics class, and I was destined to be a preacher. I shouldn't have been in that class, and I struggled, and I made a decision that lots of high school seniors make their second semester of their senior year, I suppose. I decided I don't want to try that hard, right? And I changed classes, and I transferred into this world geography class. And it was a class with lots of underclassmen in it, and these particular underclassmen in this world geography class didn't know they were classmen at all, sort of thing, and so I would show up at this world geography class, and the teacher found favor with me. I think partly because I could mostly complete a sentence, and I would talk to him, and I was kind and mostly respectful, and I had my moments, I'm sure but anyway, I was mostly respectful, and so he found favor with me. And I started showing up later and later to this class. It was the second semester of senior year, and he just kind of let that stuff slide because he didn't want to mess with it, probably. But I thought it was because he liked me. Well, Julius here is sort of in the same spot. He finds favor with Paul, and he allows Paul to do something that he doesn't allow the other prisoners to do, and that's to go on land, inside on, and he sees he gets to meet with his friends, the church, and he's able to minister to them, and the church is able to provide for Paul. This is a pretty big deal because sometimes we'll hear people talk about jail or prison or whatever and say, well, have you ever heard the phrase, 3 hots and a cot? Meaning your basic necessities are provided for there. That's not the case in the Roman Empire. Every one of these prisoners was on their own. And so this opportunity for Paul to help the church provided the church with the opportunity to help Paul. It's really interesting that even while Paul is undergoing this crisis, he's able to go and minister to the church. And it's really awesome that this provides the opportunity for the church to offer ministry to Paul. And I just think no matter the season you are in, no matter the struggle you are facing, no matter how hard life is at the moment, and there's still opportunities to help others. Right? I know that there are seasons in life where you have to take care of yourself physically and mentally, and nobody's saying don't do that. But I am saying, man, we can still share the love of Jesus. We can still bless others in some way, however small. There's tons of opportunities here at Wallula to take advantage of that. We're in the season of United as One, where we're serving and helping the Leavenworth School District, and we've got this lunch coming up on November 1st. We'd love your help providing sides and being able to serve that lunch, but maybe that's something your schedule doesn't allow, or you're not able to do that, or you have to stay away from folks because of some illness you're facing, or whatever the thing is. We have these note cards that we're just writing thank you notes to teachers and staff in the Leavenworth High School. And sort of no matter where you're at, most of us can muster enough energy to write a note card or two. We can find a way. That's just one example of finding a way to focus on others no matter the season of life you're in. By the way, I'd love you to go fill out and write one of those thank you cards today. There are a ton left in that basket we need to get through by November 1st. And so take advantage of that and find a way to help others. That's the first strategy. The second strategy is to face the facts. So Paul, they decide to leave. If you remember from the story earlier, there's kind of this back and forth. Should we stay or should we go? And they're going to head out after they stop in Fair Havens, and that's where we pick up that conversation here. I'm going to start in verse 8. Coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, the harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. A couple of things that I think are important here as we consider this second strategy, to face the facts. We need to realize that some things are definitely true. And one of the things I think is true here from these few verses is that it's appropriate and right for us to seek the advice and counsel of godly men and women around us. Paul wasn't shy, right? We know this, but he just stepped right out and said, we shouldn't leave. I don't think we might be sort of tempted to think that Paul is uttering some kind of divine prophecy here. And I just don't think that's true. I just think we're dealing with a guy who has sailed an awful lot. He's already been involved in 3 shipwrecks. I can imagine him having a conversation with a couple of those sailors. How many times have you been shipwrecked? Really? None? Once? Me 3 times. Maybe pay attention to the advice I have to offer. I think he's mostly speaking from just personal experience here. And I think it's right and it's wise for us to seek the advice and wisdom of more mature believers around us when we face difficult kinds of decisions. It's the first thing that I think we learn from this passage, this conversation that Paul has. The second thing I think we ought to learn is that once in a while, we're going to have an idea, we're going to make a decision, we're going to come to a conclusion that we believe to be absolutely right. We're secure in it. We think even that it is the godly thing to do. And for whatever reason, those in authority over us are going to decide something else. And then we have to make a decision. How do we react to that? I can't help but think of this election season when I read this conversation between Paul and Julius and the other members of the ship, because Paul turns out he's going to be right. He sort of really is convicted as to the truthfulness of what he is telling these folks. And he lays it out. This is going to be bad for the boat, and it's going to be bad for us. Let's stay here. Julius, though, he goes to the experts, right? He goes to the owner of the boat, the one with the most to lose, and he goes to the pilot of the boat, the one with the most experience, and they say, we could probably make this 40 miles to Phoenix. It's a bigger city, better harbor. Let's go. And he accepts the advice of the experts, and he leaves. And it doesn't end well. And we have to decide we're going to make a choice. We're going to gather all the information when we vote. Everybody in this room, you ought to go vote. Exercise your right. Pay attention. Study. Gather the information. Pray about it. Decide what's the best option. And then you ought to cast your vote. And some of us will cast those votes with more conviction than others. And some of us will cast those votes with so much conviction, just one vote, don't vote multiple times, just one vote. We'll cast that vote and we'll think, I am right. And this is what's best for my family and my community and my country and the world and all those things. And some of us will have those in authority or the majority who decide otherwise. What will we do then? Will we place our trust in the owner of the ship, in the pilot of the ship, or will we place our trust in God, who I promise remains on his throne, no matter what throne we set up in this world? We have to come face to face with the facts. It's the second strategy. Let's move quickly to the third strategy, which is to listen for God. So the owner of the ship, the centurion, the pilot of the ship, they don't listen to Paul. They get lost at sea. The storm comes in. It sweeps them out to sea. They're doing everything they can to figure out what to do next. And Paul steps in. He's ready to speak again. Let's start in verse 21 here. God's word says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. There's a few things that should stand out to us here. And the first one is, I just love Paul and his courage and just, his gumption, I guess, to say, you should have listened to me. Look at this. Followed quickly by take heart. Take heart, why? Because God said we would be safe. And this God is a God whom we can absolutely trust. He always keeps his word. This very night, an angel spoke to me from this God whom I serve and whom I worship. There's just this ongoing relationship between Paul and Jesus, even in the middle of this hardship. Right? Did you catch it a little later, by the way? It says in verse 24, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. That's the message from the angel. Did you get it? I mean, Paul's a guy that it would be easy, if you were a guy like Paul, to be praying, look, I know, God, I'm a part of this big mission you have for me. You said I need to go to Rome, and now I'm on my way to Rome. And so, God, keep me safe and get me to Rome so that I can fulfill this mission and be a part of your big plan and rescue me, God, for this purpose. And I bet Paul was praying that. But this little sentence in verse 24 where the angel says, I grant you the lives of everyone else on this boat. I think that's a hint that Paul wasn't only praying, rescue me, God, but rescue all these 275 other people on this boat. Would you keep us safe? Would you keep these folks who didn't listen to me before safe? Would you keep these folks who are imprisoned with me, who are criminals, safe? Would you keep those who are imprisoning me? Those who are unjustly hauling me off to Rome, would you keep them safe? Would you believe that Paul spent time on that boat day and night praying for believers? He says it over and over in his letters. Sure. But I think Paul spent time day and night on that boat praying for his enemies, praying for those folks who cast a different vote than he did, praying for those folks who have a different mindset, a different worldview, who have yet to say yes to Jesus in any way, shape, or form. Paul was there listening to God and in this relationship with him, conversing with him. It's the third strategy. The fourth strategy is just how do we respond in the midst of all that chaos? And Paul, his response was to worship. Again, he said, hey, we ought to take some food and you need some energy, and we'll jump into the story here in verse 34. It says, therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. What does that remind you of? I think Luke absolutely intends for that to remind us of the Last Supper. I mean, it's kind of in a way the Last Supper for all these guys on this boat, 276. And I think Luke is pointing back to that communion meal, that Passover supper that Jesus shares with his believers. It ought to remind us of our worship service when we break bread and celebrate communion together. Now, understand, we know, I think probably 3 of these 276 were followers of Jesus. Perhaps there were more, we have no idea. There were for sure a bunch of pagans on this boat. And I don't think what Luke is saying is that all of these pagans, were worshiping Jesus in this moment. But I think he wants to point our attention to where Paul and Luke and Aristarchus, where their attention was. On the one true God. And in the middle of all the hard stuff, he just wants to remind us that we serve a God who loves us in such a big way that he sent his son Jesus into this world, that he died on a cross, was buried in a tomb, and that he rose on the third day, and that there is hope beyond this world in a relationship with Jesus. And that's absolutely worth worshiping. Paul's last strategy here was just to worship God, to point our attention to where it belongs. Did you feel that? I know most of you are sitting pretty still. Bill, you might be a little too still. Vicky, give him an elbow. But most of us, we didn't feel how fast we were actually moving. We think we're sitting still, but it's an illusion, Mark Batterson says, of a miraculous proportion. Planet Earth is spinning around its axis at a speed of 1,000 miles per hour. Makes that turn every 24 hours. We're also hurtling through space at an average velocity of 67,108 miles per hour. That's not just faster than the speeding bullet, but it's 70 or 87 times faster than the speed of sound. So it shouldn't surprise you that even on a day when you don't think you've done very much, you've actually traveled 1,599,793 miles through space. The Milky Way, the galaxy, is spinning at a dizzying rate of 483 miles per hour. I mean, that's pretty miraculous, isn't it? It's pretty amazing. And yet, when is the last time, Batterson asked, that we've stopped to thank God for keeping us in orbit? Right? We don't pray like that. We don't say, Lord, I wasn't sure we'd make the full rotation today, but you did it again. And maybe that's the ultimate irony, that we already believe, just absolutely, that God is going to perform these huge miracles to keep us spinning and rotating around the sun. And yet we forget him in the much smaller and yet still difficult seasons of life. The trick is trusting him for even those little prayers. Let's stand and worship him right now.